Ignorance is bliss, but ignorance is still ignorance. Sure, if you never had heard about the rainforest, you might not have felt this anxiety, but I don't think living under a rock is the ideal solution. In fact, it would seem that only when you got more knowledge on the subject did you finally start to feel better about it. So I think the best course of action would not to ask our publications to stop covering the negativity, but instead try to provide a more holistic view of the negativity with the perspective necessary to fully understand the ramifications of a problem. How to start this change in the news, I have no idea, but I suppose it's something to do. Something to keep in mind. I believe what I was suggesting at the time wasn't to have total ignorance, but was to identify in yourself if you can handle the kind of negativity that comes forth in the news. So when you are reacting poorly to the news for things that are kind of isolated and far away from you and difficult to get your head round, sometimes I do believe it is better for the individual to tune out. Of course, if everyone were to tune out and we did nothing about these problems, that would indeed be a problem of itself. As for the second half of your comment, I couldn't agree more. I do think having more holistic and rational level perspectives from our news sources would be really valuable to all of us. Unfortunately, a lot of news sources tend to have biases, and you could read the same story on two different sites, one with a left or a right-leaning perspective, and they could seem like totally different stories about the same event. And I think that that in itself is a big problem. And if we were to get closer to the truth and closer to something more rational and reasonable, I think in general the news would stop looking so negative overall. The first part sounds like my mother watching the news. I think the media mainly shows the bad stuff just so people watch it, like rubbernecking when driving past the scene of an accident. But then that becomes like an addiction, and it becomes a form of gossip, which then triggers the negative feedback loop. The media even plays the same clips on a literal loop, which leads them to being spread around social media like, well, wildfire, which is why I don't really bother with social media that much either. This is a topic that I think could have its own entire video. There's so much I could say about this, but one thing's really come to mind just from reading your comment, which is that the news is a TV show and it relies on ratings and viewer engagement to keep it on the air. And so over time, the format of that show will change and evolve to keep people engaged, to keep them watching the news. And I think the recent explosion of social media and the sharing of negative news and algorithms locking people into news stories which engage them, which are often negative and reinforce their viewpoint of the world, that's really kind of highlighted what has been happening on mainstream news for a long time, which is slowly just heading further and further into that format that keeps you locked and engaged to watching the news. And of course, the news is generally negative, and learning about negative stories constantly is probably going to have a negative effect on yourself. The fires are not natural. It just cannot ignite itself, and although the fires have been going on for years, enough has burnt down that the tipping point, negative feedback loop, is very close. So it's legitimate to be worried. We should have cared about this for years. So I'm sorry if this video came off as me downplaying the importance of caring about the Amazon and environmental issues. That was not the point. I always think it's important, if we're going to care about something, to care about it correctly and not to exacerbate the problem, because then for people who doubt it, they can doubt the points that you're making. So in this video, what I've done is dug around and tried to find some more information that shone some light on some of the facts that have been thrown around, which seem to have been sensationalized, whereas to me the problem itself doesn't need sensationalizing. And if we do that and we don't talk with the real numbers and statistics, then we invite people to naysay against what we're concerned about, right? Also, some of the fires are indeed natural. I think this is just a problem with the definition of the word natural. I don't know if they're started perhaps by like a lightning strike, but they call some of these occurring fires natural because there are ways in which, a forest can catch on fire. For example, there are fire forests in the northern Americas all over the place that routinely catch on fire, and that's part of their cycle. In the Amazon, that's not the case, but fires do naturally occur there. What defines natural? I'm not entirely sure, but the idea that keeps coming to mind is probably like a lightning strike hitting the ground where there are some dry leaves and something like that causing a fire. I hadn't thought about that old sticks and stones rhyme since I was a kid, but I guess that's why there is so much stigma around mental and emotional health. We have been taught that only physical pain is valid and that's just not true. Thanks for bringing this up. For me, in my childhood, I heard the sticks and stones rhyme a lot, and I never really heard of mental health being talked about until I was, let's say, in my 20s. And I'm really, really happy to see such a movement where we're trying to open up being able to talk about our feelings and our mental health. And I really do think it is a good and strong movement with a lot of positive outcomes. Once we start learning to look internally, we can really start to grapple with a lot of the things that we go through as people. And I believe that destigmatizing having mental health issues is really positive in society. Some people might differ their opinion, but having a positive experience through actually thinking about that, about myself, what is going on inside of my head, what's happening with my emotions, and learning to reflect on it, it has been very positive for me overall, and I hope it would be positive for other people who try to do that as well. It's nice to hear calm, reasonable talk about this. I have to admit I've been feeling anxious about how this might affect the Minecraft channels I watch. This is actually something I aim to do with most of the topics I engage with, is to be calm and reasonable, try and be rational, accept that I'm human, I'm going to be fallible, there's going to be biases, and I think with a good intention at heart, when you look at certain topics, hopefully something reasonable will come through for all of you to take away from these videos. And on this particular point, I feel like anxiety isn't particularly helpful to feel in certain situations like this, where most of it is really far out of your control. And also, of all the things I've seen unfold and happen, all the corners and turns that we've taken, a lot of the time on YouTube, things get blown up and are made to be hysterical, and then time passes by and things aren't quite as bad as they once were. Of course, there have been creators throughout YouTube's history that have been really hurt by big changes that they've made, but for the most part, the site does continue, and things do go on for the most of us. Of course, we don't want bad things to happen to individual creators, some that get hurt by these changes, but overall things generally seem to head in a good direction, and that seems to be the case on YouTube in my opinion. Google collects data from everything. Even your phone is sending them data about the sounds it hears. I've experienced this many times. For example, I had my phone on with me when I've been talking about something, and then when I went to YouTube, the first ad I saw was about the exact same subject I had been talking about earlier. And no, it wasn't coincidence, because I'd never seen those kinds of ads before, and it was only that one time. So there are two big answers that I hear often in response to this kind of question. One of them is that you are actually being spied on. I believe Siri and definitely Google's Cortana are known for taking the microphone's input and then translating it into text and sending it off to Microsoft. I know that is very well documented. It happens in Windows 10. If you have Cortana running on your PC and a microphone plugged in, it is taking the words you say, translating it, sending it to Microsoft, and they are using it to advertise to you through the adverts built into the store. As for Siri, I don't know as much about that. As for Android, I've mostly heard it being denied that it records audio. However, the other side of the coin that I've heard is that the data that's being collected is quite rich. Every little thing about your behavior is being tracked and stored. When you turn your phone on, when you open up particular apps, timings, where you click on the screen, there's so much complicated data coming through, and the algorithms can actually work with all of that and then churn out results, because there's just so much data to work with, because there's so many people interacting with their smartphones. And so if this is correct and they're that sophisticated, then they can predict your behavior in ways that will really, really surprise you. And I would suggest to, perhaps the next time this happens, just think about how perhaps this isn't the case. Maybe you're not actually being specifically listened to, but your behavior is predictable. For example, maybe there is a trend that's going around and it's becoming a thing, and then adverts are going to appear on the internet. And so when you come in contact with other people and they're already talking and doing these things on their phone, then it comes over to you and you start getting advertised to. I mean, it might not apply to your specific case, but just think about it in that term. There are bigger trends going on in society. There's other people using phones that create data that then you might become a part of, right? It might be like you're doing these things and now you're going to do that next, like all these other hundreds of people. Hey Asuma, please can you release these as podcasts in mainstream podcast players? For right now, we're just going to see how things go. That wasn't actually something I considered for this channel. I kind of thought it's all going to stay on YouTube. Maybe one day we take what we got here and we turn it into a podcast, but it's possible we could try and launch it on other platforms. Maybe once we have like a bulk of content here, we could edit together some of the more popular videos and turn it into a podcast somewhere else. So I thank you for your input there. That's quite valuable and definitely something to consider in the future. Will the videos always be 5 to 7 minutes long? I'd love to have 30 to 45 minute podcasts, but I understand that would be a huge chunk of time cut from your day, so maybe not. For now, these things are just being taken from my live streams, which people say are podcasty, so you can always go check that out. There is a lot more stuff going on in those podcasts than just these talky bits, so it might not be for you. And I just said podcast, of course I mean the live stream. I mean, I do really enjoy podcasts, and maybe one day this will transform into something like that, and we can always experiment with the content going forward in the future. So maybe there'll be compilations that are 30 to 45 minutes long. There's also the xisumasays playlist, so maybe you've watched every video so far, but if you're new to the channel, you can load up a playlist and there's probably at least 30 to 45 minutes of content for you to enjoy there.